So I want to take you through some of the warning signs and what we call Helix Smells and anti-patterns that we see a lot in the technical consulting world, working with some of our customers, working with some of our partners, and kind of point these out to you. So if you do run into some of these, maybe you can walk it back or think about what you're doing before you take it down a little further. So with that said, though, let's start off with just some terminology so that we're all on the same page. Code smells. This was first mentioned in a book called Refactoring by Martin Fowler. I think Kent Beck actually came up with it. But code smells are not necessarily problems, but they're an indication that something might be wrong in your code or might be wrong in the way that you're doing something in your code. So they have a couple of really distinct markers to them. There's something that requires investigation. It's not something you're going to take a quick look at and identify. They are easily identifiable, which is where the name smells comes from. They're called sniffable. You can see it, you see it, and you're like, not sure about that. And again, it might not be a problem. It's just something that kind of sets off your radar and needs some more investigation. And so the concept of Helix Smells is, again, something coined by Martin Davies. And if you haven't seen Martin's blogs and videos, the Virtual Developer Day last year, he's got some great content on this. And I would implore you, if you're really interested in Helix and kind of the methodologies of software design around Helix, definitely check out his content. But Helix Smells are essentially code smells as it applies to a Helix solution. And finally, anti-patterns. Anti-patterns is a coin turned in the mid-90s, I think, by Andrew Koenig. Anti-patterns look like something that's a software development practice or a pattern, but it actually leads you to a bad spot, not a solution. So anti-patterns, you want to identify those and you want to avoid them as much as possible. So we're going to identify a couple of common patterns and smells and anti-patterns like this oddly shaped pie here. But again, as we go through these, remember that smells are not necessarily problems. There's something to investigate, think through, talk through. Anti-patterns, on the other hand, should be remediated whenever you encounter them. It's not something you want to carry forward and get to a point where you're not supportable, not easily testable, not easily maintainable. As Nick said earlier, Helix is not a scorecard. It's not a checklist. It's not a requirement. It's just a set of guidelines to help you out. And certainly, I think Nick's been building solutions before Helix. I've built solutions before Helix. I'm pretty sure most people in this room have. Helix is not the only way to build a Sitecore solution, but that's what we're talking about today. So with that said, I would say the most popular anti-pattern that we see. Anyone have a guess as to what the biggest offender would be? No? Okay. Oh, Jesus. I feel like we've almost already talked about this before.
How'd you know that? Yeah.
So yes, exactly. It's the concept of using Habitat as a starter kit, or as I like to call it, git clone Habitat, F2 on Habitat, put your company name in there, and we're done. So again, why is this an anti-pattern? Why is this bad? It's a good example of what's called cargo cult anti-patterns. And again, if you haven't heard that term before, it's this concept of taking a solution or taking some technology, not fully internalizing it or understanding it, and hoping to get the benefit of that technology without really grasping or grokking what it does. So we get around this now, as Nick said, the new Helix examples repository. Take a look at that. We've got some different technology in there, something to take a look at.
Still not a starter kit.
Still not a starter kit. However, if you do want a starter kit or you want some better tooling to get you to a starter kit, we're going to talk a little bit about some great efforts in the community out there that you can use as starter kits and tooling for that. So hopefully, not belaboring this, hopefully this is the last time you hear about this at Symposium, right? Great. So the second most common anti-pattern or smell that we see is really atomic design as a feature. And I think atomic design, mid-90s, Brad Frost, I think, came up with it initially or was on the forefront of that. The concept of using small components and assembling them into larger components and then reusing those components across a website. So there's certainly nothing wrong with atomic design. I think still very valid today, but atomic design as modules is not really in the spirit of Helix. And what do I mean by that? I mean things like feature.accordion, my company.feature.accordion, my company.feature.carousel. You're not really solving a business need or a business domain issue with that. You're not really presenting a feature. You're just presenting some functionality on the website. So how do we get around this? Again, atomic elements like carousels and accordions and calls to actions and footers, headers, navigations. These are all great, but remember, we want to group everything together in the guise of a business domain. We want to solve a feature or present a feature to our customers. So go ahead and gather all of those atomic design pieces together and revolve them around a feature, an actual business feature, products, events, whatever's correct in your taxonomy and your domain.
And if you have these sort of simple content components that are very common in a solution like promo, accordion, text block, header, and so on, I think it makes sense. In Helix examples, we kind of group those into a single module we call basic content, or whatever makes sense to your business domain, to your users.
Scaffolding, divs, pages, spreaders, headers, columns, etc. Next, modules with too much going on. What does this mean? So this could start as maybe a module that's got too broad of a responsibility, or it could start maybe as requirements change from an initial release. So maybe you design a module such as a product, but then somewhere down the line you need to build a B2C product instead of a consumer product. And those reasons for those products and those reasons for change of those products are radically different. And so you just lump it all in the same module that you've always had, even though it's radically different. This can lead to some smells like fat foundation or fat feature products. Again, these are some coined terms by Martin Davis. He's written about these. He's talked about them in the VDD. I'm not going to go through them here, but again, just too many responsibilities in one piece of module in Helix. And then another one that we see a lot of is just having a foundation.utilities that has pretty much everything in the kitchen sink in it. Right. Some helper classes.
Maybe a Sitecore extensions module.
Oh, yeah, never heard of that one. Yeah, very, very habitat-y. So what can you do here? Just remember that as you're putting together your modules, the stable you want stability, and stability is really coined as the number of dependencies on your code. It's not a comment of quality about your code. It's really just how many pieces of my solution depend on this code. So the more dependencies you have, that code should be more stable, should have less reason to change, shouldn't change as often. So review the number of dependencies on your modules. If they seem like maybe you have multiple reasons for them to change, it might be time to refactor that code as opposed to having multiple responsibilities on it. A good exception to this rule that I see a lot of customers using is a foundation module for support patches or Sitecore support. Certainly hot fixes in your code, patches from support. I know Sitecore is an infallible product, but theoretically, if you had patches for your code, these aren't things that you directly can impact on, right? You're going to work with support to get a patch for an issue. Certainly, that's something you could see multiple patches in a single module at the foundation level. Slow builds, large solutions. I think coming back to Habitat as the only solution that people had a chance to look at early on for a Helix solution. This is kind of a side effect of that, right? And the way this kind of manifests in what we've seen, a lot of people using Gulp even though they're not really fond or familiar with Gulp, for example. So there's a little bit of cargo cult there, but again, we didn't have enough examples out there to show you that Gulp wasn't really a requirement or the only way to do things. It was just what was in Habitat as a task runner. Same thing with solutions that are using testing. We see a lot of customers creating test projects and then not writing any tests. And then thinking that we're testing. So again, if you're not using those components, maybe TDS projects on things that have nothing to serialize, and another good example of that. So maybe that's some premature optimization, maybe that's, it could be a couple of different things, but if you're not using those technologies, if you don't need those projects, if you're not doing those types of things, don't include them in that module. So again, what are the possible solutions we have here? So Nick talked a little earlier about module boundaries not necessarily being physical. I think we heard pretty loud and clear from the community that that's not always what we want to do. So certainly the Helix examples solution that Nick talked about and is up on GitHub now has some examples of logical boundaries instead of physical boundaries. Use the technologies you're comfortable with. I know this sounds I know that's a real radical thought here, but if you don't like gulp, don't use gulp. Use grunt, use chef, use MS build, use none of the above. Whatever you really like. Technology isn't dictated by Helix. We're just trying to show you how you could use some of these technologies to accomplish things.
And if you are using gulp, as Al mentioned, just make sure you're looking at the latest and last Habitat version of those gulp scripts. It had some significant improvements to the performance of the gulp build in there.
And we had some nice contributions. I know Nick's put some time in there. I think James has as well. Yep. Investigate the new SDK style project format. So this is new in 2017 and newer, I think, in Visual Studio. Easier to maintain project format, a lot slimmer, not as verbose, builds faster. And of course, Visual Studio 2017 and up, I think, also has this concept of lazy loading projects. So you can actually open solutions faster. We've definitely heard that feedback as well. And another thing I see a lot actually is consider using multiple solutions for your team. What does this mean? So maybe you have a solution with every module that you need. Maybe you build your foundation modules and put those uploaded to an internal NuGet server. And then you have slimmer solutions that your development team can work on day to day. Not everybody needs to be in the foundation every day, right? So that there's ways you could get around that and still maintain and get all of the benefit of Helix.
And in Visual Studio 2019, you have the concept of filtered solutions as well, which allows you to look at a reduced set of the solution without having to have a totally separate solution file.
That's a great point. So maybe just a quick lightning round here. I'm not going to go too deep into these. We are planning to record a larger version of this talk once we get some feedback from you and some more feedback from the community on this. But atomic deployment of modules, I've actually seen a couple of partners do this. Make a code change to just a feature module and deploy it. I would call that a smell. Certainly if you know what you're doing and you have a good process together, you could do that. It's not really what we would recommend or dictate, but some customers are doing it, but I would call that a smell, maybe not doing full deployments there. Inter-feature or inter-project dependencies. We've seen a lot of people come up to us and say, there's no way I can do X in my solution without having a reference across features.
And I'll show you solutions to that momentarily.
And Nick's gonna show a couple of ways to get around that by doing some abstraction later in this talk. Beware of soft dependencies. Again, this is an anti-pattern, but if you have anything hard-coded to a path, if you have an enum file with GUIDs in it, those are soft dependencies. If those items change or the path changes, your code will stop working. Again, maybe not necessarily a problem, but something to be aware of. And premature optimization, we talked a little bit about that, but if you're not using technologies or you don't need all of the projects in a particular module, don't put them in there. And we'll talk a lot more about premature optimization later in this deck. So before we go into some of the community tooling, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Always be thinking about your solution architecture. Refactoring is not a four-letter word. It's not a four-letter word. It's just part of the process. So as you go through your sprints, as you're As your features change, as your business requirements change, you may need to refactor, and that's okay. But always be thinking about that. Maybe as part of your sprint planning process or part of your retros, always be thinking about that.
Not just okay, but expected. You should expect refactoring and not be afraid of it.
Not a four-letter word. Use the principles as a guideline. And again, we've heard loud and clear that a lot of developers want to know why we're doing these things. Hopefully some of the edits we've made get you a little closer as to the why of Helix. But use those as guidelines. Certainly these are guidelines. I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, my implementation is special because I need to do X, Y, and Z, and you guys don't have a guideline for that. You're right. Your implementation is special. I agree. And we're never going to have a comprehensive enough set of guidelines in Helix that's going to cover every situation. So always go back to the why, kind of use that as a guideline and go forward from there. And finally, learn the song before you improvise. So I like a lot of blues music, a lot of blues trios, just people that play the same song over and over and over and over again. And every night it sounds a little bit different. You know, the drummer goes off and does a solo. Guitarist is going to do like a really cool 3/4 time thing and then come back to 4/4. I kind of think of software architecture that same way. You've got to know the song before you start riffing, and all of your team have to be singing the same song as well. So when it comes time for you to deviate and go do that solo or do that awesome drum fill, the rest of your team knows where you're going and where you're coming back to. So before you start deviating from Helix, just understand why you're doing it. You may need to do it from time to time, but always come back in time together and finish the song.